Hello and welcome to this video. I was just sat at home. As you can see, I'm not in my studio, and I was going through some old notes, and I came across some of the notes that I'd written down when I was coming up with my 10 greatest heavy metal albums. And I'd actually come up with a list of what I thought were the 20 greatest heavy metal bands, and I was looking at the list. I thought that's pretty cool. Now, what's interesting, when I made this list, this was inspired by a conversation I'd had with the great Shane Embury, who's the bassist with Napalm Death. Now, Shane's the same age as me, and although he is from and the longest serving member of the heaviest, screamiest, fastest, loudest, grungiest band in history, Napalm Death, we started to talk about our definition of heavy metal coming up late 70s, early 80s, enthralled inside the movement here in the UK, which was known as the new wave of British heavy metal, what our definition of heavy metal was. And I turned around to him and said, well, what's your definition of heavy metal, Shane? And he turned around and went, well, the Scorpions. And I thought, that's strange, that is, but it's exactly my definition. The Scorpions are a heavy metal band. Led Zeppelin aren't, Cream aren't, Deep Purple aren't, but the Scorpions are. And that is my sort of division. Now, of course, it's my division. It might be Shane's division. It means nothing really, but I thought from that viewpoint it's interesting to come up with 20 bands which sort of encapsulate that sort of worldview of my age group, looking back to bands that had come just before and bands that came in afterwards, and trying to come up with the 20 bands which I have here. Now, the other thing I had an idea about was I've been thinking of trying to make videos that are shorter but have got the lists are longer, so I have to sort of race through them and just hit the points. Well, that's what I'm going to try and do on this. So we've got 20 bands here. I don't want to spend, normally that would be a 2-hour video for me, wouldn't it? So what I'm going to try and do now is going to run through these pretty quick, create this little video. If this works and people love it, then I can do these, just jump up and come up with these mad lists and see what people can say, see what people think about them, and whether they agree on or not. And that's all half the fun, isn't it? And this is twice as good as a top 10 because it's a top 20, so shall we kick off? So at number 20, I have UFO, formed in 1970. Made a couple of dodgy sort of psychedelic albums in the early days, and then with the addition of the incredible Michael Schenker, one of the great guitarists for creating the landscape of rock guitar, especially the 1980s, they go to this much heavier sound. Phil Mogg's incredible voice, very strong songwriters, able to write almost like pop songs, but with killer riffs and a heaviness and a crunchiness that was just a little bit beyond the bands that had gone before, but taken from those bands. Of course, they made many a great album, but they're most well known, I think, for Strangers in the Night, the album that came out, I think, in 1979-80, which is a double live album, and was a key album for my age group. I absolutely loved that album, and it was an essential album and set up what was going to happen in the UK in the early 80s in terms of the new wave of British heavy metal. Schenker left in 1979-80, just after they'd done Strangers in the Night, to go and form the Michael Schenker group. And I'm going to include that group as well here, UFO/Michael Schenker group, because of course those first few albums were quite incredible. Everyone goes for the first Schenker album, which I think is called Armed and Ready, is it? I'm not too sure. Then the second one's just called Michael Schenker group. I'm not too sure here. I'm at the limits of my knowledge. But the second one had Cozy Powell on drums. It was very influential for me personally, that album was. They then brought in Paul Chapman, who'd been in a band called Lone Star. And they did some great stuff. And that was the era that I knew them in. I actually got that album, which was that called No Way Out. I'm not too sure, right? But I'm right at the extreme of my knowledge with UFO. Obviously, I've just decided to jump up and I'm doing this. And are you waffling, Andy? That is enough for UFO. Let's move on to number 19. So at number 19, I felt he should be on the list. And I didn't want to put him too high up because it looks like favouritism, but I have put Napalm Death at number 19. Napalm Death sort of, they personify the most extreme aspect of metal for me. When I was coming up, as a young guy in the 1980s, and I was listening to all sorts of music, but I was a big heavy metal fan. We had an arena documentary was shown on the BBC, and they covered quite a few bands in there. Metallica was in there, sort of Cliff Burton era Metallica. I'm trying to think who else was in there. But what's, struck me and many other people was the appearance of Napalm Death live, being the heaviest thing we'd ever heard in our lives, but also interviews that had taken place, I think, in Shane's bedroom when he was a much younger man, and it really personified the spirits of British heavy metal, which I think is going to be a thing that comes out on this video. Napalm Death, though, after making the first two albums, which of course do what they're famous for, which is like tracks that are very short, and they do You Suffer, which is like 1 second long and all that. But after that, they actually become a very, very sophisticated band, which are with a much wider remit of sounds, really exploring all different aspects of heavy metal, to slow grindcore, to, fast, to, and to exploring classic heavy metal, like the bands we're talking about on here. So, they have to be on the list. I don't know whether it's in the right place. I don't want to look like, oh, Andy only put that on because he, Shane Embry a bit, and so he wants to kiss his bottom a bit, But and I do want to kiss his bottom. Shall we move on? So at number 18 we have Anthrax. Now, of the classic, Bay Area thrash metal bands that came out in the early to mid 80s. There's the popular ones that are on this list. I've got this band low down, but me personally, my favourite of the thrash metal bands was Anthrax. Anthrax weren't from the Bay Area, of course. I think they were from New York, and they had a different vibe, right? There was a different vibe. It was a more cosmopolitan vibe. They didn't seem to rely so much on that sort of gothic heavy metal imagery. Where Metallica had albums where you got like graveyards and puppety strings on Master of Puppets, or lightning and all this type of stuff. Anthrax were a lot more light-hearted, a lot more schlocky in terms of the horror references they've got. They're much more of a George Romero band than a Hammer horror band. I felt instrumentally they were very strong, very interesting. I thought Charlie Benante was the most out there on drums. I think Charlie was probably one of the first to actually play a blast beat, because they were experimenting with so many different sounds. For me, Among the Living, Persistence of Time, these are just the big yellow album with the spire on the front. What the hell's that one called? But those are the classic albums for me, and I live by those. They also had a spin-off that was called Speak English or Die, which you couldn't get away with now. It was a parody of sort of these far-right, thrash metal bands. Absolutely incredible. And I can remember when I was really into Anthrax, and I absolutely loved them. They then paired up with Public Enemy, and that pairing was such an inclusive thing for heavy metal. I think that was a point in music where it allowed metal to expand as it does into the 90s to all the different, the grunge and the rap metal and funk metal, and all this stuff was almost allowed when Anthrax teamed up with Public Enemy. And the reason why it was so important, because they seemed like they were mates with Public Enemy. It wasn't some sort of music industry decision. It was a friendship decision, and it was as though they felt that Public Enemy were heavy metal, if that makes sense. And that made sense to me too. So that's what we've got at number 18. I'm going as fast as I can. When I got into heavy metal in 1980, as we all do, as a young kid, and it's a thing that a young kid does, and it's a very important thing, and I want to celebrate it here, is you start looking for the heaviest bands. And this is why the market has provided bands like Napalm Death, and, this is the fastest, most screamiest band you've ever heard. And kids, especially adolescent boys, they think bigger is better and faster is better. And so in 1980, I went searching for that band, and the band that I found at that point were such a groundbreaking band, and that band was Venom. Venom was the sort of the heaviest band around in 1980-81 when I was getting into heavy metal. They were the darkest, they were the most sort of satanic, they were the fastest, they were the noisiest, Now, going back to them now, what you hear is it sounds like a more satanic Motörhead, perhaps. But I cannot tell you how important this band was to my age group and to me. Now, did I listen to Venom all day long? I didn't actually, because my tastes were expanding. But Venom for me represent the beginning of the stuff that's going to happen in the 1980s. That for me, that was the band. And all the stuff that I got into afterwards, the thrash metal I got into, speed metal, also technical guitar playing and all that sort of double bass drum stuff, and also some of the avant-garde stuff that I was listening to in jazz, bands like Last Exit. For me, personally, and I'm sure this isn't true of everybody, but for me, it was Venom. And Venom were an incredibly important band for me, in terms of the search for the loudest, heaviest thing. Now, I think when I first did this channel, I didn't want to think about this. It seemed a bit childish and teenage for me. But I think the search for heaviness and the idea of heaviness as being an attribute of music. Music could be sad, it could be happy, it could be exciting, it might make you want to dance. But the search for heaviness, which I think links to an otherness, a countercultural otherness that as a teenager, especially with teenage boys, you hit adolescence and suddenly you look at the world and go, I don't really feel a part of this. I don't feel the same as what my friends think. They seem to be thinking different to me. That whole thing that's personified by the tune Subdivisions by Rush is exemplified for me in 1980 by drawing the logo of Venom on my pencil case at school. And that's what they represented. Now, for an age group a little bit older than me, it would have been the band that I've got at number 16. Now, I have to be contentious. I know the comments are going to get filled up with this. But at number 16, I have put the Sex Pistols. Yes, I have put the Sex Pistols in the 20 most important, greatest heavy metal bands of all time. The Sex Pistols reformed around about 2010, 11, something like that. And I went to see him reformed. I went to see him live. And up until then, I've not ever been a fan of the Sex Pistols, but people will know that I am a big fan of the Sex Pistols, especially John Lydon. And the reason is because I went to that gig and it blew me away. I just loved it. I thought I was going to hate it, but I loved it. And the thing that blew me away was they were just such a great band. I've seen a million bands live. I've seen a million rock bands standing on stage, pretending to rock, but they didn't rock, right? Forget the punk ethos, forget that. You can call them a manufactured band or not. You can call them what you like. But what I saw on stage was a great tight metal band with some crunching riffs, great songs, great choruses, and it was in your face. And the Sex Pistols, and there's other bands that did it as well. The Ramones did it, the early Clash albums, they did it. But the Sex Pistols, I think, because they were so huge in the UK and it was such a cultural phenomenon that a lot of the jazz groups, what am I talking about? A lot of the heavy rock groups, it's all right, because I'm sat at home. I've got to tell you, somebody just drove onto my drive. I'm watching them down there. Think what they do, but they pulled off. They were just turning around. I thought I'd got an interloper then. And so, of course, my brain went onto autopilot and I said the word jazz, which is what happens to me. But we're not talking about jazz. We're talking about, in the 70s, rock bands who were there toddling along, heavy rock band in 1975. Then suddenly Sex Pistols come out and they're sort of heavier than you are. And I think that influence on those British bands then begats your Iron Maidens and your Diamond Heads and your Venoms. That's where it comes from. When I saw the Sex Pistols live, they didn't seem like a punk band. The punk band is like fast, that's what you expect from a punk band. But the Sex Pistols like, and I can feel like my neck wanted to go, but my head wanted to go, and I wanted to do a little bit of a headbang. And so I put them on the list, and I don't care. Sex Pistols. And I think if we thought of the Sex Pistols as a heavy metal band and just got rid of the idea of punk, it would change our view of the history of rock music and how it all fits together. But I know no one's going to do that. Now, if we look at this period, this new wave of British heavy metal, which is the underlying theme throughout this list for me, because of being my age and having my experience in music, there was actually a vibe going on at that time, there was like certain venues for us where I was in the Midlands of the UK, Stafford Bingley Hall. Stafford Bingley Hall, I'd get the evening mail, look in it and go and look down the lists. Right, also the Odeon up in Birmingham, and you'd look to see who was on. You go, White Snake's on, or UFO's on. And if you get a list of the bands that were on in those venues in 79, 80, 81, you'll see it's just a big list of heavy rock and heavy metal bands, right? So that was very important. Of course, on a Friday we had Tommy Vance with the Friday Rock Show, and that was the guiding light for this movement. It was the only time on the radio you're going to actually hear Venom or the Scorpions. And so every Friday I was sitting with my headphones on, next to my dad's stereo, tuned into FM Radio 1, with my two fingers ready to go on the record buttons in case there was anything that was going to be on. And that show not only was our contact with everything that was going on in the world of new wave and British heavy metal, but it also had jazz fusion and prog on. It was all there. And also, at this time, Sounds put out a supplement, a heavy metal supplement, which turns into the magazine Kerrang. So we were all buying the magazine Kerrang. Now, somebody recently sent me a PDF folder of all the, I think it's all the Kerrangs actually, right from all through the 1980s. And I've been scanning through them. And every single page is like this massive just dose of nostalgia and recognition of me seeing something and then being a kid and staring at it and understanding the world in a way from these what was coming through Kerrang, which seemed to be a window into some alternative universe that didn't really exist in my school, except in me and about 4 other people. Now, this sort of little group that we were all in, this little army of heavy metalers, headbangers as we used to be called back then, the band that really personified that was Saxon. And I absolutely love Saxon. And Saxon is the band I've got at number 15. When they first come out on their first album, and they released their first single, which I bought. I actually found this single, and at the time I was too young to buy it at the time, but Big Teaser, which was their first single, I bought. So I found it had been sold off, but it was only a couple of years later. And so that was the first Saxon record I bought. And going back to it now, it's a pop song, basically. It's got backing vocals on. But Saxon slowly developed this sound which personified this movement. And right at the peak, when we were all into it, they brought out Denim and Leather. And Denim and Leather, just that tune, just personified. He describes it. If you want to know what I'm talking about, go and listen to Denim and Leather. They're the band, really. If I think back to 1980, I'm in the house. My mum's cooking the dinner. I'm listening to Saxon on the stereo, really loud. Biff Byford's there going, "She's a big teaser. She's a big teaser," like that, going in the background. And my mum's shouting, "What are you listening to? It sounds like Norman Wisdom." She said, "What's he saying? Mr. Grimsdale." And that's how I see him. I always saw Saxon as a bit that they were very serious. They were always writing stuff about JFK getting shot and stuff like that. But they were very funny. They were almost the personification of a heavy metal band. Of course, once they get to the 80s, they went all Def Leppard and went all sort of hair metal, and it wasn't the same. But they're still great. They're still going. I think Brian Tatler from Diamond Head is now playing guitar with them, and I don't know Brian, but I met him a few times. So I got him on Facebook, so I can see they're still going. Biff Byford looks the same, even though he's about 80 years old. Incredible band. And I have to say about Saxon as well, when I was writing on my pencil case and drawing all the logos, the S of Saxon with those Viking axes built in, that was hard one to master. The whole logo was. That's what Saxon represents to me. They are just heavy metal. What's the most heavy metal band in history? Saxon. That's where we're on the list. We're up to 19 minutes. And I am at 15. So at 14, I've scribbled out a whole bunch of grunge bands. Grunge is really important to metal because in the 80s, you got the thrash bands, right? And they're doing their thing. But mainstream rock has turned into Poison and Winger and all this type of stuff. And grunge pulls this back in. But I decided just to put one on the list, and for me it's Soundgarden. The reason is because Soundgarden seem to be the closest to the spirit of Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and all those bands that went before. Chris Cornell is undeniably the greatest rock singer that's ever lived. The riffs are incredible, and I think what you get with Soundgarden, if you want to hear heavy metal but without any of the cheesiness in, something that is artistically very valid and worthy, then Soundgarden is the band. Matt Cameron, incredible drummer. All those bands, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Smashing Pumpkins, all incredible bands, and I'm trying to represent the whole of that with Soundgarden, because I didn't want to fill my list up with grunge bands. I wanted to concentrate on these bands that nobody ever talks about, that have been sort of maligned, like Saxon, and the band I've got at number 13, which is a masterful band, a creative powerhouse of a band, and it is Megadeth. And the thing about Megadeth is it was, Dave Mustaine, of course, had been in the original Metallica. He was part of the original movement in the Bay Area in the early 80s. He was a key figure. And he gets the push, which is very odd, because a lot of people at that time when they were seeing Metallica were seeing the charismatic frontman that was Dave Mustaine, and so he's out in the wilderness, and he managed to get this band together, Megadeth, and when they come back, he comes back with a vengeance, really, and he sort of identifies the serious themes that made thrash metal so important and why it spoke to us so much, although I was a little bit old for it, so it was a bit passé for me, but I can remember it very powerfully. And for me, Megadeth represented the sophistication in terms of the concepts. A band that I nearly had on this list, which is not on his Queensryche, who was another band that even more, this is like conceptual, almost like progressive heavy metal. And Megadeth are a little bit like that. And also for me, of all the thrash bands, once they took on Marty Friedman on guitar, Megadeth seemed to be the closest to these other bands that I haven't got on this list, but the Racer X's, the Cacophonies, and all that guitar LA virtuoso thing that was going on, which I've represented by one band very high up on the list. Because for me, I come from a generation where we played and we had to play well. All my friends can really play, and they might be into fusion or jazz, or they might be playing funk. But when we go back to the root of it, it was heavy metal, and it was musicians like Marty Friedman that set a standard, if you're a guitarist, that you had to conform to, which made you a greater player. And this never gets mentioned. So this is why Megadeth are on my list. At number 12, I have the aforementioned Scorpions. I put them there. So the Scorpions are a bit like UFO, or one of those bands that joined sort of classic rock of Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple in the early 70s with the heavy metal of the 1980s. Now, the only Scorpions that I really like, was when Uli John Roth came in. And Uli John Roth came in sort of taking that sort of Richie Blackmore vibe, expanding on it with a whole dose of Hendrix, because there was a whole ton of Hendrix with Richie Blackmore. And so the spirit of Hendrix in terms of heavy metal sort of goes from Hendrix through Blackmore to Uli John Roth, and then to people like Yngwie Malmsteen. And Uli John Roth was so important in for me in terms of creating that, what was going to be known as neoclassical rock, that aspect. Now, the Scorpions were a great band. They had sort of these twin guitars. They had this really crunchy riffs. That's what I loved about Scorpions. They're great as well. Great songwriting. And so it wasn't one of my favourite bands personally. I was much more of a UFO guy because of Schenker. Of course, Schenker was in the on the first Scorpions album, because his brother Rudolph was the guitarist in the Scorpions. But the Scorpions, I think, are key. And I actually hadn't put them on the list. This is the one I added just now before. I thought, well, I can't, but I've scrapped out a band. I scrapped out to put this in, which I thought they sort of, I moved a few things around. But the band I took out was Rage Against the Machine, which I think are a key band. So I'll mention them, and I will mention some bands at the end that I think we could mention as well. I'm trying to go as fast as I can here, and I'm up to 25 minutes. So at number 11, I have got Thin Lizzy. Thin Lizzy. And why? because they personify that twin lead guitar sound, right? And Thin Lizzy they were around for a while, and they made many albums in the early years that weren't heavy metal albums. They were sort of a mixture of, I would say, sort of rock music and Irish folk music. But when they got the two guitarists in, and when you get that Scott Gorham, Brian Robertson combination, suddenly those two guitars start to work in a certain way. And the sound of that, along with Phil Lynot's incredible voice, a unique, beautiful voice, something that you lose in metal. Phil Mogg's the same, a signature voice, great songwriter, and then possibly the greatest, I would say, classic rock drummers to ever be, which is Brian Downey. Brian Downey is just astonishing to me. I mean, going about Ian Pace and John Bonham, Bill Ward, and they're all incredible. But the guy that's equal to that for me, if not even a bit beyond it, is always astonishing. And so often he's astonishing because of the fact that he's laying down these shuffles, and they're so relaxed and they're so integrated into the sound that when you listen to something like Boys Are Back in Town, you're not aware that it's a shuffle. You're not aware it's like Status Quo. And it's heavier. Thin Lizzy, I think, have to be on this list. Any person making metal in the 1980s would have been enamored with Thin Lizzy. Now, when I came to Thin Lizzy, they were making their last album. And John Sykes, the late great John Sykes, was playing guitar. And that Thunder and Lightning album, of course, John Sykes has been in Tigers of Pantang, a band that didn't make the list, but were another of my favourite bands of the new wave of British heavy metal bands. I might have to do a video just on my top 10 new wave of British heavy metal bands, because there's so many, and we all like different ones. And I love Tigers of Pantang solely because of John Sykes, because I was into that fast guitar playing that he was doing. I was into Gary Moore as well, another guy that came from Thin Lizzy, and it was the guitar aspect of Thin Lizzy that was so important. But in 1982, I think it was, maybe 83, when Thunder and Light came out, this was a ridiculously heavy, out there, virtuoso, new wave of British heavy metal album. Phil Lynott delivered with that. Now, in 2004, Thin Lizzy reformed, without Phil Lynott, because he obviously died in 1986, and John Sykes took over the role of not just playing lead guitar alongside Scott Gorham, but also singing the parts. And it was astonishing how he sounded like Phil Lynott. And I actually was playing with a blues guitarist called Ian Parker, and that UK tour, we went up and down the UK opening up for Thin Lizzy. The late great Michael Lee was on drums as well, who played with Robert Plant, and it was interesting for me. I just finished playing drums with Robert Plant to spend that week with Michael Lee, who was an absolutely lovely guy, and sadly is no longer with us as well, and it was incredible to see them up close. And we ended up doing a gig in the Renfrew Ferry, which is an actual ferry in Glasgow, and the sound check didn't go well. It wasn't going well at all. And I remember John Sykes was actually got in a bit of a mood about this. And so the sound check was sort of toddling along, and they weren't really getting anywhere. And I was sort of trying to get my stuff on the side of the stage. And I was chatting to Michael Lee, and Mike says, "Do you want to play my kit?" Now, Michael Lee was about 6'6" or something. And he had this huge silver double bass drum kit with 26-inch bass drums. So when you sat on it, it felt like you were stood up. And I remember sat on his kit, and I started to do some beat whilst the band was sound checking. And of course, the band jammed with me whilst I did this beat and tried his kit out. So technically, I have played with Thin Lizzy, although it's more of an interesting story than a boast. And I think that's the only band I've actually played with on this list in any shape or form. Shall we move on to number 10? At number 10, we have Diamond Head. So Diamond Head and that record Am I Evil that came out around about 79, 1980, that one song. Now, I never got the Diamond Head album, but I had that single. And that had a whole set of ingredients in it. It was fast and thrashy. It was heavy like Black Sabbath, but heavier. It had that sort of satanic imagery, and it also went on for a while and had sort of progressive rock tendencies. And with that track, it sort of personified this aspect that's going to come out in heavy metal in the 1980s, which would be the sort of fusion of a punk ethos with progressive rock. Iron Maiden are doing a similar thing. Now, when you think of Iron Maiden, they come out their first album in 79, and then The Killers is 1980, and then it's not until you get the acquisition of Bruce Dickinson and on Number of the Beast that we start to hear that sound. Lars Ulrich, who was also a big fan of the new wave of British heavy metal, had come over from the States and was in the UK checking it out. And he chummed up with Brian Tatler, just up the road from here, with Diamond Head. And so he was studying that band directly. Then he goes back to the States, taking this sound with him almost. And we start to see in the Bay Area the emergence of a sound that is coming directly from the UK. Now, when I said this, people argued with this, and I'm sure, yeah, there's loads of other influences there. But this is interesting because if you listen to Am I Evil, it's almost like a blueprint for the thrash metal bands. And when they, quite recently, they got together and you had the Big Four go out and do their big tour, the culmination was them getting all up on stage and playing Am I Evil and bringing Brian Tatler out. And I was very proud. See, what you're seeing here is, this is West Midlands pride, you know. This is I'm proud of Brian Tatler. I'm proud of what he did for music, you know, because it just shows how important the Midlands is to heavy metal. Always there, Napalm Death, Diamond Head, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest. That should be the big four. Those four bands, you've personified heavy metal. Stick Duran Duran in there, you got the whole lot. Right, shall we carry on? So, at number 9, I have Slayer. Slayer, for me, are the personification of an American thrash metal band. The rest, Sepultura, Anthrax, Metallica, Megadeth, they're a thrash band with extra bits attached to them. They have extra bits attached to them, a sort of a quirk, if you see what I mean. Slayer are almost like the platonic embodiment of thrash metal. The satanic imagery, the riffage, the virtuosity in the drumming, because when the thrash metal thing came out, by that time I'd become a bit of a jazz fusion fan, so I was into my Vinnie Colaiuta and Dave Weckl, and I was looking down on rock music a little bit, you know, it's all easy, anyone can play that, I'm into all these fusion drummers. And then the thrash metal bands came out, and the drumming, it set a new standard. And for me, Lars Ulrich was great, actually. I thought he was great, but he wasn't that level of virtuosity that you had with Nick Menza, with Megadeth, Charlie Benante with Anthrax. But the sort of the don of thrash metal drumming was Dave Lombardo with Slayer. And I think it's the combination of the riffage and that drumming. That is the definition of the new sound for me. And so that is what Slayer represent. At number 8, I have Pantera. Now, this is where Slayer wasn't really a band I listened to that much. I was more of a Metallica and definitely an Anthrax guy, and Megadeth. They were sort of the fourth for me. I absolutely love Pantera, which Pantera were actually around from the early 80s. I think their first album with that awful cover was 1982. So they're there and they go through the whole thing, and then they turn into sort of a bit of a glam metal band. But in the early 90s, they sort of pull it all together and they become this sort of post-thrash metal stoner band. They're just so good, right? Phil Anselmo is, I think, the greatest screamer of all time. He screams like you expect a metal singer to scream, but it's melodic and catchy. Vinnie Paul on drums, absolutely incredible. And probably the last band to really have real drums on an album, because of course all modern metal is all programmed and processed and loads of quantization and re-triggering. But Vinnie Paul's really playing the drums, and you can hear it. It feels like a band playing in a room. Dimebag Darrell was just the greatest rock guitarist who didn't know what they were doing. He is a creative genius, but he's not a Marty Friedman. You don't feel he knows any scales or theory. I don't know how he's getting around the guitar, but it's just pure rock guitar, and I absolutely love them. They are here because they are just such a great rock band. And what else can I say? coming out of that glam metal thing, Cowboys from Hell, and then Vulgar Display of Power, which for me, I can remember back when you used to have these late night metal shows on the TV, and I'd actually woken up in the middle of the night and I was like, oh, I can't get back to sleep. Let's put the telly on. And I put the telly on, and this, as soon as it started up, there was this rock show, and I didn't even choose to watch the rock show, and they were showing the video for Mouth of War by Pantera. And this is what heavy metal does. There's these moments all the way through my life when metal can come along and surprise you, and it did. And part of it was so heavy and it was so melodic, but also I felt a little bit lost inside the sort of, it's almost like King Crimson in a way. It had this, I mean, it was in 4/4, I think, but I wasn't too sure. You know, absolutely brilliant. So that's who I've got at number 8 is Pantera. At number 7, I have the band that is the reason why I'm here talking to you now. The band that personified that year 1980, that when I went from being a kid just listening to what was in the charts and not being particularly interested in music that much, to someone where music became my life. And this happened in 1980. It actually started up in February 1980 with the song by Rainbow, All Night Long, and then Whitesnake brought out Fall for Your Lovin', Judas Priest brought out United, and around about this time, Motörhead came out with Ace of Spades, and I remember buying that single. I can't remember why I bought that single, because when I took the single home and put it on, the shock was that starting up. It was the greatest shock of them all. Like I've just described with Mouth of War, the ultimate point in my life was that Saturday morning when we come back from town. I'd got me little Ace of Spades single, red, with the Ace of Spades logo, black and white on the front. It's so in my mind, right? I'm 12 years old. I think I'd gone down and I'd seen the word Motörhead in Kerrang perhaps, or heard it mentioned, but I don't think I knew what they sounded like. So I bought it. I mean, this could have sounded like Def Leppard. It could have sounded like Saxon. You know, I'm pretty sure I hadn't heard it. So I take it home, I put it on the stereo, I'm sat there waiting for it to start up, and as it starts up, I leapt out of the chair and started jumping around the room. Out of control, really. Now, I've spoken about Motörhead so many times on this channel, but they are the band for me. This is the band where it all starts. And so every time I've talked about them, I learned a little bit more why they were so important to me. And I think it is that actually they're the conjunction of everything. They're essentially a rock and roll band. They've got aspects of the new wave of British heavy metal. There's aspects of psychedelic rock in there. You know, they come from originally from Hawkwind, which is a progressive rock band. So that's in there. And although the music's not proggy, the themes are proggy. I really enjoyed the fact that Lemmy would write about history, about the war, and he would go into all these things. I love that. And the band was incredible. I don't care what anyone says. Filthy Animal Taylor, the drumming, if you go and listen to Bomber and Overkill, that drumming, that was like the standard double bass drums out there, fast Eddie, incredible. What can I say? I've spoken about them so much. And Lemmy just seemed to be like this cross between an out there rocker and an English gentleman. He personified the whole lot. There's two people. One is John Lydon, and one is Lemmy, and they really represent something. They represent an Englishness. It's a rewriting the idea of the English gentleman. I know it sounds bad, but that's what I feel, and I think that's the power of them. So that's who I've got at number 7, is Motörhead. Now, at number 6, really high up on this list, and I know this is going to upset people, the 20 greatest heavy metal bands of all time, I have got Rush. Okay? Now, I could say, they're like the original progressive metal band, and they brought in this sort of time signatures, and they were the first band to do all that. And then when Iron Maiden came out, and then the thrash metal bands, they've got a bit of Rush in them. And I could go through that aspect. And of course, Rush influences every single rock band, That's not why I've put them on the list. I'll tell you why. Because if you look at the mid-70s, right? And this is a contentious thing. We've talked about UFO. We've talked about the Scorpions. We've talked about another band that we're going to mention in a minute. These bands that heavied up heavy rock, that took what Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin were doing, and they heavied it up, right? Made the riffs crunchier, made the beats faster. And these are very important bands. They're not on the list. You know, Rainbow Rising should be here, and they're not. And why aren't they? Because their place is taken by Rush. And why is that? Because if you go back to that first album, forget Neil Peart, right? This is the whole thing. Neil Peart is such an incredible force of nature when he comes into Rush that we forget about that first album. But when I first discovered Rush, Removing Pictures, when that came out in, I think, 81, and I bought that, and then I was a massive Rush fan, you know, because I was playing the drums, and it was technical, and it was complex and intellectual. It was like intellectual heavy rock, and I loved it. I then picked up, or my mom did for me, Archives. And so I had those first 3 albums. And when I put the first album, not having the story in our mind that this is Rush with Neil Peart joined and they were proper Rush and all this stuff, but what I heard was just the most bone-crunching riffs of all time. Bone-crunching like Sabbath, more than Zeppelin, more than Deep Purple, actually more than even UFO. You know, Working Man, What You're Doing. These tracks were just so heavy, so crunchy. And Alex Lifeson does not get the just deserves that he should get, whatever the saying is. He does not get the credit for bringing the guitar up forward. They were only a 3-piece as well. And again, his bass, you know, go and listen to that first album. And of course, once you've got that aesthetic, when Neil Peart comes in, and he's a massive like Jethro Tull, and he's a massive like Genesis fan, and all this prog that he loves, and he starts to bring that into it, right? They take that bone-crunching riffage, which they had pioneered in 1974, 75. I can't think of anybody else that's really riffing like Rush. I can't think of anybody. When you take those riffs and then put Neil Peart's drumming on it, and you get the second album, and you listen to Bite or the Snow Dog or Anthem, you know, or, you know, Beneath, Between, Behind, and all those tracks that are out on there. I won't go too far, because the last time I did this, I, you know, mentioned a whole bunch of tracks off Caress of Steel. I got confused, because to me, that was all one album. It was this great big Rush triple album, and I did not differentiate between any of that stuff. And I went back, What You're Doing and Working Man, they were like an Anthem, I love that one, and the Necromancer. Those were the tracks that I went back to. 2 of them, and that the big track at the end that starts off with one bit like Stay Twin builds up. What's that called? Incredible. All of it's brilliant. All of it's brilliant. It just rocks. John Rutsey, great rock drummer. I don't, obviously Rush did not have the commercial success of that time off that first album, so we can't see it as being a big influence. But you could argue it that they were well ahead of their time in a way. 1974, 75 sounding like that. At number 4, and this is going to upset people as well, they're going to say they're not a heavy metal band, I've got Van Halen. Van Halen, right, I love them. Dave Lee Roth, Van Halen, not so keen on anything after that, but I love them. I've got every single Dave Lee Roth album, except for the one when they came back. I didn't want to go there. To me, Van Halen was the band that brought in all the virtuoso guitar playing that you could was astonishing, obviously. But it also brought in an approach to double bass drumming, fast, frantic beats. For me, before the thrash metal band came in, the thing that was blowing me away in terms of speed was tracks like Loss of Control or Hot for Teacher. The opening of Hot for Teacher is so heavy metal, with that and all the drums flying off, and you know, Eddie Van Halen's Lamborghini banging away, exhaust banging away all in the mix. And I know they have a swagger, and I know there is much hair metal, which is not heavy metal. I understand all that, but there's an aesthetic in the music where this was the fastest, most technical band at that time, and also greasy and dirty. You know, they were a real rock band. And this is why they're on the list, because they then inform the Steve Vais and the Yngwie Malmstees to some extent. You know, Disturbing the Peace by Alcatraz was a very important album for me. And then we suddenly have The Deluge, and you get Cacophony and Racer X and Richie Kotzen and all this stuff that's coming out. You know, Paul Gilbert, Vinnie Moore. All that stuff for me is so important in heavy metal. It's like if you've got a heavy metal band and they do a guitar solo, they sound like that. And that goes back to Van Halen. Van Halen are a heavy metal band. Not all the time, but there's moments, especially in 78, 79, when there's no real band playing like that. Alex Van Halen, I felt, took from Billy Cobham. It was the drum beats, though, that double bass drum approach that you hear on Quadrant 4. And Simon Phillips, also a big Billy Cobham fan, had taken that sound and put it onto an album by the band I've got at number 2. So I'll leave that there because I thought I was being clever then, but I realised I got a band in between number 4 and number 2, which is the band at number 3. And of course, the third greatest heavy metal band, because we're to the top 3 now, these are the important ones. The third greatest heavy metal band in history is Metallica. And they're so all-encompassing. And everything they've done has been so under a microscope for the last 40-odd years, right? That's... They've pushed the boat out, they've experimented, they made awful albums with Lou Reed. You know, they've done Santanga where they tried to change the sound of metal. They pushed the boat out, and now they're like granddads. They've returned to the original sound of Metallica and everyone's happier. But in the end, I'm glad they did all that, because Metallica, in the last 40 years, right, are the most important heavy metal band of all time. The only way I could describe, because I don't want to go on about it, I mean, you all know about Metallica. The only way I could describe why Metallica is so important, right, is a few years back, I went to see Chris Cornell. And he was doing his acoustic tour. And he said that he decided to do a really famous song in this acoustic tour to win the audience out. You know, a real massive song that everybody knows. He'll do it on acoustic guitar. You know, he'd done Billie Jean by Michael Jackson, blowing everybody away. So he decides to do One by U2. Okay? Oh, everyone likes that. U2, you know, straight down the line, conservative rock, you know, everyone's going to love that. And he'll reshape it. So he goes over to the internet, he types in One song, and that doesn't come up. He said Metallica's One came up, because Metallica's One is bigger than U2's One. And Chris Cornell said, wow, that's the power of heavy metal. It's bigger. It's bigger than U2. And then, so he thinks about it, and he thinks, isn't this bizarre? Because U2 are doing what every corporate conservative rock band should do at that time, sing about oneness and all being together. Metallica aren't singing about that. Metallica are doing a heavy metal thing on that song. They're singing about a guy that's been in the war and has been injured to such an extent that he has no senses, no vision, no hearing, no feeling, and he's trapped inside his own body, and it explores the terror of that. And Chris Cornell said, he goes, that is heavy metal. To take that subject matter and put it out to the masses. And Metallica have been able to do that better than any other band. Lars Ulrich might not be the greatest metal drummer of all time. You know, they might have their quirks. They might have explored stuff. But one of the things that really made me proud of heavy metal was when I watched the interview. I think it might have been Howard Stern had done it, but someone did an interview with Metallica, and Elton John was there. And Elton John turned around and said to James Hetfield that he really was impressed with their songwriting. And James Hetfield is really moved by it. And the reason is because Metallica wrote brilliant songs. And at their peak, even, and I'll knock the Black Album, because I was one of those 80s thrash guys and we liked, you know, Massive Puppets and Ride the Lightning and even Injustice for All. But through all of this, they wrote brilliant songs. And when I looked at the greatest heavy metal albums of all time and I put Masters of Puppets on, every little bit of it you want to listen to. It's not just you there rocking out and because it's fast and heavy. Every riff, every vocal is just, they are brilliant songwriters. Then this is every single genre. It always comes down to this. The people at the top of this list wrote great songs. Because at number 2, as you probably guessed, a great song that Simon Phillips, the jazz rock fusion drummer, played on is a song called Dissident Aggressor, and it crops up on Priest's third album, is it? Sin After Sin. An album that was very important for me. I bought it when I was getting the first Judas Priest album I bought, and it just blew me away. And that track, again, like Van Halen, was one of the first tracks I'd heard with like crunching riffs and fast double bass drums, you know. They do it there, 1976, after Sin After Sin. Now, if we go to the album before, Sad Wings of Destiny, that is the album where Judas Priest, who have really come from this sort of heavy rock, hard rock band like a Led Zeppelin. I mean, on the first album, Rock and Roller, if you watch the videos of them when they first performing, you know, and they've got all the sort of flowy robes and the long Robert Plant hair. Well, Rob Halford has, you know, you could see they've come out of Led Zeppelin, like Rush, the same thing. But then they harden it up. Judas Priest are really the most important band in creating heavy metal as we know it, of taking that heavy rock and then making it, the guitars fuzzier and tighter and crunchier, and making the drums more bone crunching, and altering the aesthetic from sort of hippies to sort of bikers, the leathers, the studs, almost verging on sort of a gay sort of culture, which of course is very interesting because, and I'm going to touch on it here, there is an aspect of adolescence where boys, I think, a certain thing that emerges in adolescence, and maybe we'll call it a confusion, a kind of confusion of identity, at some point was dealt with by heavy metal bands. I could do a whole video on this, but it'd be very contentious, you know. And maybe the current situation where that identity is dealt in a different way, you know, with a certain thing. I'm not going to get into this. I'm moving on. The point is that that period where not every boy, but a certain boy, I was one of those boys, you know, and my bedroom was full of men with long hair, makeup sometimes, looking very pretty and pouty, dressed in gay S&M gear. You know, Motley Crue. The thing with Judas Priest was, when I bought Sin After Sin, I just was blown away by it. I thought it was incredible. That build up on this, it was Dissident Aggressor. That was the heaviest track for me. That represented everything. And that build up, and it builds up, and then it goes, and you get this sort of choir of Rob Halford, just unbelievable sound. And then he shouts, canyons. That is so metal to do that. And then Simon Phillips, and he goes, that double bass drum comes in. It's like, and it's compound time as well. It's just unbelievable. Blew me away. Loved the sound of it. So I then went and bought another album straight away, and I bought Point of Entry by Judas Priest. And it was just... I bought United when that came out as a single, and I went and bought British Steel, and that's a much better album than Point of Entry, but none of them really had that feel that Sin After Sin has got. So I have a trouble, I'm telling you the truth here, but I'm objective enough to be able to stick them at number 2 on my list. So who have I got at number 1? It's Black Sabbath. They're the first, they are the best, they are the greatest, they are the heavy metal band, right? They invented it, and everybody else is just pretending in some way to be Black Sabbath. That's all they're doing. But Black Sabbath just have it naturally. And the thing about Black Sabbath is, when they go in the studio in '69 to do that first album, and they have like about 12 hours to make it, so they basically just put their live show down. That's heavy metal. Up until then, there's, you know, Steppenwolf perhaps, you know, and the Kinks, Did You Really Got Me, and you got Hendrix, Purple. You're going to say it when I've talked about this. But the truth is, heavy metal as we know it is laid down in those few hours by Black Sabbath, and they don't put a foot wrong. And then, because that's a success, and the critics hate it, this is what makes heavy metal what it is. The critics hate it, nobody gets it, but the people love it. It's the music of the people. It's the music of the disenfranchised, but not the intellectually disenfranchised. This isn't like punk. This is just normal people that know they're not a part of this big thing out there. And Sabbath represent that. And Sabbath, I take the mickey out of them because there's a certain Birmingham naivety to what they do, where you think this shouldn't work, this should be terrible, but it's a brilliant, and I take the mickey out of it, not because I think it's terrible, but because I think it's brilliant. And then within that, because it's a big success, they get pulled in and they have to make an album on the run. Paranoid, it's the greatest heavy metal album ever made. Then back in the studio, Masters of Reality, Black Sabbath Volume 4, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage, right? And each of those albums gets heavier and different as it goes through. Sabotage, is that 1974? Same year that Rush did. That's the only album that is the heaviest album. And their heaviness sort of then unbalances itself. Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die. I actually think the stuff on there is really interesting. Once you've set up that you love Black Sabbath and you go, right, they're going to go down and explore everything else now. I find those albums fascinating. I love listening to them. And then once Ozzy goes and they get Ronnie James Dio in and you get Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules and Live Evil, those three albums for me, all of those are the greatest heavy metal bands. Even Never Say Die, they're the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. That's such a run of stuff. I can remember buying Axe Attack in 1980, the second one, so it'd be 82, Axe Attack 2, and it had got Die Young on, and that was the first time I heard the Ronnie James Dio version of Black Sabbath. My God, it was like another world had opened up again. They really are geniuses, all of them. They really are. Bill Ward, his approach to metal drumming is completely unlike any other drummer. He's delicate and jazzy. He creates beats that he doesn't rely on just slamming heavy rock drum beats out. He creates just genius things. I mean, it's like War Pigs. That's heavy metal there. The drama of that is just incredible. You know, you listen to what it's especially on Paranoid. The drumming is just incredible. It sounds like it's like a jazz drummer, like it's like the Doors. That's what Bill Ward's doing. And when he goes for it, when he heavies up, there's an abandon there. The heaviness isn't coming through the drums sounding like cannons. His drums always sound quite muffly and light. It's just the way the excitement he puts into it. Geezer Butler is a second guitarist. There's no bass player in Black Sabbath. They got two guitarists and they both play the same riff, right? And that comes out of Geezer being a guitar player. You know, he's modelled himself on Cream. But what Cream do is, if Eric Clapton's playing a riff, Jack Bruce is like this jazz guy and he's playing all around it. But Geezer Butler didn't know how to do that, so he just played the riff, and there is where heavy metal is born. Is having the dual guitar riffs. Tony Iommi is just a bloody genius, and you hear the experiment with guitar playing that he's doing, and yet I feel that he was a very strong guitar player before he had his accident with his fingers. He was a very strong guitar player, loved jazz, listened to Django Reinhardt, and you feel all that's in there, and it's actually he is one of the great rock guitarists, like with Richie Blackmore, Jeff Beck. He's one of those guys in the late 60s, top of the game. But that thing with his fingers draws him in. And that is the thing that you cannot account for, right? And it's the ability to overcome a setback like that, where you get told, and Tony Iommi gets told, oh, you got to give up the guitar now. No, I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up. That working class fight, that's what Black Sabbath represent. And then Ozzy, who He's the greatest heavy metal singer of all time, and yet nobody copies him. Nobody sounds like him. Every other metal singer walks around all being doomy and screaming. Ozzy doesn't do that. Ozzy walks around the stage clapping and laughing because he is having a brilliant time. He is just in a state of pure joy. I saw Sabbath live in 2000 with Ozzy, and I can remember watching him and thought, my God, this guy is, no one notices it, but he's just walking around and clapping, and there's no, again, it's this thing of not being cool. It's something I champion on this channel, not being cool. And the thing with heavy metal, it's great art, and it's great art because it's not cool. You have to appreciate it purely on its artistic credentials. And in that respect, it is the antithesis to all this pretentious gaff that all the music critics think is wonderful, which is why they've never thought Black Sabbath are any good, or Judas Priest, and is why now they grudgingly look back and go, yeah, they're one of the most important bands of the 1980s. It is Metallica, isn't it? It is Iron Maiden. It's not Cabaret Voltaire, is it now? Right, so that was a pretty short video. How long was that? Hope you enjoyed it. I may as well, if I knew I was going to do this, I thought I'll just get up. I'm not going to go in my studio. I'll do a quick video. I cannot do, I'm going to keep trying to do it. I'm going to try and do a short video. Because the idea that I don't have to say as much means I don't have to think as much. But when I get going, you know, I know I get a few facts wrong, but the point here is looking at these bands we love and going, what is it about them we love, and why is it? For all my sophisticated jazz and stuff I listen to, why can't I not shake heavy metal? Why do I love it so much? And it's because of what it represents. It represents real art away from the elite, educated, middle-class view of why rock and roll is great. And they can talk about the Ramones, and they can talk about all this stuff and say how visceral and honest it is. But it's not honest. Honest is Venom. Honest is Angel Witch. Honest is Tigers of Pantera. Right? Those are the bands I want to listen to from that period. I'm not interested in the other stuff, because the other stuff's fake. It's either record company commercial nonsense, or it's what the critics think is cool. And the critics do not understand when something rocks. And when all these bands on here, they know how to rock. They know what a riff is, and they know how to use it. If you like this video, stick a like on it. If you want to see some more like this, then you can subscribe. Please subscribe, come on. I have a whole bunch of links down below to my Patreon, to my PayPal tip jar, to I've got a button now on YouTube where you can put a little bit of donations in, because obviously this is how I make a living now. I've also got a Substack. If you're a creative musician, you've got this far and you want to know how to get your head round, say, the internet, I want to have a listen to me chatting with my friend Rob Groker about that. I've just put an exclusive on my Substack. It's also on Spotify as well, of me chatting with Rob about this stuff. I'm going to be doing this a lot more, even more rambly than this, or just audio of just chatting about stuff, and it's going to be more music business related stuff. That's what I'm going to be doing on Substack. So if you want to get over to the Substack, links down below. I've also made my Bandcamp a subscription model. It's a much better way of getting your music now. It's what Spotify should have been, is that you're a fan of a band and you go in and you buy a subscription. Right, and if it's your favourite band, you buy a subscription for like 10 years or a lifetime, and it's very, very cheap. But you're there, you paid up, and then you can just access whatever you want. That's the way it should work. You could subscribe for a month, or you could subscribe for a year. This is what is going to save the music that we love. I tell you this now, and I'm here to try and push these ideas. So if you want to support me in this, support me, and that is much appreciated. We're at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.